Nolan Simmons thought he had another easy target, just another outdated guest to humiliate on live TV. He mocked, laughed, and pushed, sure that his stage, his rules, would break Clint Eastwood. But he forgot one thing. Clint doesn't break. Within moments, the tables turned and the so-called host was the one drowning, scrambling for a way out. But just wait until you hear how Eastwood shut him down for good, and why the crowd went absolutely wild. The studio was a pressure cooker, buzzing with an almost manic energy as the opening theme of the Nolan Simmons show blared through the massive speakers. A polished, dramatic, orchestral piece, the kind that was meant to sound important, yet came off as just a little too theatrical, like a circus act pretending to be a gladiator battle. Cameras swooped and zoomed, capturing every flicker of movement, every shift in expression, because this wasn't just a talk show. This was war, a nightly televised execution where the host, Nolan Simmons, lived for the kill. And tonight, he thought he had a big one. The man sitting across from him, stone-faced and unfazed, was Clint. Freaking Eastwood, yeah, that Clint Eastwood. The one whose stares could turn grown men into cowards. The one who, even at 94, carried himself like someone who had seen things, done things, that Nolan Simmons and his Twitter-obsessed audience could never even begin to comprehend. And yet, Nolan didn't see the danger. No, he saw an old man, a relic, a walking museum piece, a once great legend who, in Nolan's mind, was now just another conservative punching bag, ripe for humiliation. He had done it before, to politicians, to actors, to ex-military guys, even to fellow journalists. Take them apart, chop them up, feed them to the audience. That was the Nolan Simmons brand. The audience had been prepped for this. They had been primed to laugh, to cheer, to celebrate his inevitable destruction. They were all so sure they knew how this night would go. But Clint Eastwood wasn't just another guest, and Nolan Simmons was about to learn the hard way. The second the show went live, Nolan leaned forward, flashing the camera his signature smirk. That smug, razor-sharp, I'm smarter than you grin that had won him a career of viral moments and internet fame. Clint, by contrast, barely moved. He sat back in his chair, relaxed, eyes unreadable beneath the bright studio lights. His face was lined with age, yes, but there was a weight behind those lines, the kind that came from a life of actually living. Nolan didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't care. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and went straight for the jugular. "So, Clint," Nolan started, his voice soaked in mock friendliness, like a salesman about to scam an old lady, "you're a Hollywood icon. But let's be real, your views are outdated. Some would even say dangerous." The words cut through the air like a blade, designed for maximum damage. The audience chuckled. A few even snickered. Nolan could already feel it, that high he got when the crowd was on his side. That drug-like rush of control. He could already see the headlines. Clint Eastwood gets schooled on live TV. Nolan Simmons destroys aging actor with facts and logic. Hollywood legend fails to defend his outdated views. Watch him crumble. He was sure of it. This was his moment, another scalp for the trophy case. And yet, Clint didn't react. He didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't even flinch. Instead, he did something, strange. He tilted his head just slightly, like a man watching someone dig their own grave. And then, in a voice so calm it sent a chill through the room, he simply said, "What people?" Silence. For a fraction of a second, something in the air changed. Then the audience, still under the illusion that this was a joke, laughed. Not because the line was funny, but because it was Clint Eastwood, and Clint Eastwood saying anything was, in their minds, supposed to be funny. They were wrong. Dead wrong. Nolan, still high on his own confidence, let out a smug chuckle. "Oh, you know," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "Rational people, the ones who believe in progress, the ones who think that maybe, just maybe, it's time for guys like you to step aside and let the next generation lead." The crowd burst into applause. Nolan leaned back, satisfied. He could already feel the win. Meanwhile, Clint's fingers tapped lightly against the armrest. His face, unchanged, his eyes, still locked onto Nolan. But something shifted, the kind of shift that makes animals go quiet before a storm, the kind of shift that makes men rethink their choices. Nolan didn't notice. Not yet. But the audience? They did. Their laughter felt wrong now. Like a joke that had been told at the wrong time, in the wrong place. Like the kind of laughter that shouldn't have happened. Because even the dumbest person in that room could feel it. That awful creeping sensation in their gut. Something was coming. And when it hit, it was going to hit hard. Nolan smelled blood. The tension in the studio had shifted, but he didn't see it for what it was. No, he thought this was his moment, his kill shot. So he leaned in, just a little, basking in the attention, feeling the power of the crowd on his side. "See, Clint," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, like a teenager trying to explain TikTok to his grandpa. "The thing is, we get it. You had your time. You were an action hero. You played cowboys and tough guys." He gave a mock shrug, casual, dismissive. "But you're pushing 90, man." He let that one sit for a beat, the number hanging in the air like a final nail in a coffin. "Maybe it's time to accept that your brand of tough guy masculinity is, well, obsolete." The crowd oohed. That mean, hyped-up studio audience loved it. They thought Nolan had just put the old man down. Nolan himself felt unstoppable. That grin of his stretched even wider, his chest puffing up just a little more. And then Clint breathed, a slow, deep inhale through his nose, so deliberate it was almost a warning. He looked at Nolan, not just at him, but through him, right into him. And for the first time that night, his eyes truly locked in. The room froze, and then, in a voice that sounded like it had been dragged across gravel and sharpened with steel, Clint asked, "You ever shot a man, Nolan?" Silence. Not a breath. Not a cough. Not a damn sound. Nolan blinked, his mouth opened, but nothing came out. What? His voice had lost its swagger. Clint didn't blink, didn't even move. "You ever stood in front of a man who wanted to kill you?" The way he said it, so casual, like he was talking about the weather, made something deep in Nolan's stomach clench. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. Clint kept going, voice low, steady, merciless. "Or better yet," he mused, tilting his head slightly, "have you ever had to be the man who decided if someone else got to walk away from a fight?" Nolan's face twitched. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Well, obviously not, but Clint didn't let him finish, because Clint wasn't done. "Then let me teach you something about obsolete." He leaned forward just slightly, enough that the lights caught the hard lines of his face. And when he spoke next, his voice was thunder rolling in the distance, slow, deep, and coming closer. "Obsolete is thinking you can disrespect a man who's been through hell and expect to walk away laughing." The audience, not one of them was laughing now. Nolan shifted. For the first time, he wasn't just performing for the cameras, he was reacting. And it wasn't the reaction of a confident host, it was the reaction of a man realizing, far too late, that he was in a place he should not be. Still, he tried to salvage it, tried to claw back control. He forced out a nervous chuckle, his hands gripping the desk just a little tighter. "Clint, come on, this is just a conversation." Clint's stare didn't waver. "You're not having a conversation," he said. And God help Nolan, but the way Clint said it, it felt like a sentence. "You're picking a fight, and there's a big difference between those two things." Something invisible but heavy dropped into the room. The audience knew it. The crew knew it. Even Nolan knew it. The energy had shifted. This wasn't an interview anymore. This was a warning. Nolan swallowed hard, but his pride, that damn TV host ego, wouldn't let him stop, wouldn't let him walk away. So he doubled down. "All right, Clint, fine, you're a tough guy, but the world's changed." He threw out his arms as if trying to encompass all of modern society. "No one needs a guy with a gun anymore. We have laws, we have diplomacy. We don't need cowboys." The moment those words left his mouth, Nolan knew he had just made a mistake. Clint's mouth twitched, not into a smile, into something sharper, and when he spoke next, it was soft, slow, and final. "Son," he said, voice so low and steady, It almost sounded like a ghost speaking through the static of an old radio. You'd be surprised how fast the world remembers it needs cowboys when things get ugly. And just like that, Nolan knew he had lost. Nolan snapped. The unraveling had been coming for a while now. Anyone in the audience with half a brain could see it. But the thing about men like Nolan Simmons, they never see it themselves, not until it's too late. For 20, maybe 30 minutes, he had danced on the edge of control, poking, needling, pressing every button he could, waiting for Clint Eastwood to break. But Clint never broke. And that was driving Nolan insane. His patience snapped like a dry twig, and for the first time that night, his mask of detached confidence cracked wide open. His voice rose, losing its usual calculated smoothness, taking on an edge of something closer to desperation. "All right, let's be real, Clint," he spat, his hands gripping the desk, his posture stiff, like a man trying to hold himself together while the ground beneath him crumbled. The way he said Clint's name, hard, sharp, forced, was the first sign he'd already lost. "You're just bitter because the world doesn't cater to people like you anymore." A pause, a charged moment of lingering arrogance, the last breath before the fall. Nolan could feel the audience still with him, still waiting for the kill. So he went for it. "You're used to being the tough guy, the one in charge." He smirked. "Here it comes, the finishing move. And now, you're just another old man yelling at the clouds." The audience gasped. And then, because Nolan's show was built on a foundation of trained reactions, because these people were here to see someone get slaughtered, some of them clapped. But that clapping, it was hesitant, like even they weren't sure if Nolan had just stepped somewhere he shouldn't have. And Clint? Clint laughed. Not a quick chuckle, not a polite scoff. No, he laughed. A deep, slow, dragged-out chuckle that sucked the oxygen out of the room. It wasn't laughter meant to be shared. It wasn't laughter meant to be understood. It was the kind of low, gravelly sound that made the back of your neck prickle. The kind of laugh you hear from a man who knows something you don't. And Nolan? For the first time all night, Nolan Simmons felt it, that creeping, slithering sensation in his gut. That awful, unshakable realization that something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. The audience, once on his side, wasn't laughing with him anymore. They were watching, waiting, like they knew what was coming next. And when Clint finally spoke, his voice was almost amused. Almost. "You think I care about what you or this audience thinks of me?" His tone was casual, but there was an edge beneath it. Something sharp. Something that told every single person in the room this just became something else. Clint leaned forward. Just enough. Just slightly. His hands rested on his knees, his fingers tapping once, twice, like a man getting ready to deliver a lesson. "I came here tonight for one reason." Another pause. Controlled, measured, letting the words sink in before he drove the knife deeper. "To see how much fight is left in men like you." He shook his head, slow and deliberate, and then he gave the verdict. "And I gotta say, not much." That did it. Nolan's face turned red, not out of righteous anger, not out of controlled fury. This was something else, something that looked a lot like embarrassment. He wasn't a predator anymore. He was prey, a small, desperate animal realizing far too late that it had walked into the wrong place at the wrong time. His fingers curled into tight fists beneath the desk. He was losing this, completely, and he knew it. So he did what desperate men do. He lashed out. "That's rich," he bit out, his voice strained, barely holding on to the veneer of control, coming from a guy who built his career playing fictional tough guys. A weak jab, a flimsy last-ditch effort to reclaim his ground. But Clint didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, his eyes gleamed. And then he delivered the kill shot. "And yet here you are, treating me like the real deal." The room exploded. Laughter, cheers, even whistles. This wasn't Nolan's audience anymore. This was Clint's. Nolan's fingers twitched. This was slipping. No, this was gone. He scrambled, reached for anything. Something. His voice faltered as he tried to regain control. Oh, okay, so maybe I was a little harsh. A weak retreat. But let's not pretend like the world hasn't evolved past your ideas of masculinity. A lifeline. A desperate attempt to make it seem like Clint was the one behind. You're just mad because guys like you aren't in charge anymore. The second those words left his mouth, he knew. He had just made a mistake. Clint's mouth twitched, not into a smile, into something sharper, a look that had ended men before they even knew they had lost. And when he spoke next, it was soft, slow, final. You think men like me aren't in charge? A pause, long enough for Nolan to feel every second of it. Then Clint gave a slow, knowing nod, and in a voice so quiet, yet so absolute, he delivered the final blow. Son, the only reason you get to sit there, safe and smug, is because of men like me. Boom! The crowd exploded. Shouts, whistles, people on their feet. The kill shot had landed. Nolan's confidence shattered. He opened his mouth. Asterisk, asterisk, tried to say something. Anything. But nothing came out, because the damage was done. Clint sat back, casual, unbothered, letting it sink in, letting Nolan sit in it. He had won. And Nolan? Nolan had never felt smaller in his entire life. Nolan was done. You could see it. The way his shoulders slumped forward, the way his fingers twitched against the desk, grasping for something solid when everything around him had just collapsed. His face had gone pale. That self-assured arrogance drained out of him like air from a popped tire. His eyes, once full of smug superiority, were now darting across the studio, to the cameras, to the audience, to the producers off stage, looking for a way out, looking for someone, anyone, to save him. But there was no lifeline, no clever edit that could fix this, no producers who could cut to commercial, no audience to cheer him back to life. Nolan Simmons had just been destroyed. And Clint? Clint knew it. He watched the younger man wither in front of him, taking in the sight with the kind of expression a father might give to a kid who just learned the hard way that playing with fire gets you burned. He let the moment linger, just long enough for Nolan to fully absorb his defeat. Then, with a sigh, a slow, deep exhale, like he had just finished putting down an old, tired dog, Clint leaned forward one last time. His voice, when he spoke, was almost gentle, not mocking, not angry, just final. Look, kid, he said quietly, like he was explaining something simple, something obvious. You might not like men like me. Hell, you might even hate us. A pause, a heavy pause, long enough to make Nolan flinch. But one day, when the world gets dark, and trust me it will, you're gonna wish there were still men like me left to handle it. Silence. Thick. Unrelenting. Nolan swallowed, his throat dry as sandpaper. He didn't even have a comeback left in him. Because what do you say to that? What could you say? Clint stood up, buttoned his jacket, slow, methodical, unfazed. Then he turned, not to Nolan, not to the cameras, to the audience, the people, the ones who had laughed at the beginning of the night, the ones who had cheered Nolan on, thinking this would be another easy takedown, the ones who had watched, helplessly, as the balance of power had shifted right in front of their eyes. Y'all have a good night. That was it. No final jab, no victory lap. Just a simple farewell. And then he walked, not rushed, not flustered. He just walked off stage, untouched, unbeaten, untouched by the flames Nolan had tried to set. For a moment, just a moment, the studio sat in stunned silence. Not because they didn't know what had just happened, but because they did. Then, the audience erupted. Cheers, shouts, claps so loud they drowned out everything else. Some were on their feet, some were laughing in disbelief. It wasn't just applause, it was a reaction, the kind that couldn't be faked, the kind that meant one thing. They had just witnessed something historic. And Nolan? Nolan slumped, like a marionette with cut strings. His hands shook as he tried to pick up the pieces of his career from the floor. His eyes darted around wildly, still searching, desperate, for something to salvage. A joke, a line, a snarky comment. Anything. But it was too late, because Clint Eastwood had walked into the lion's den. and left without a single scratch.